Welcome to the Lift Your Story podcast with our guest, Daniel Hess.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lorianne. I am that gal from Milton, Ontario, Canada, and I am with.
I am that guy. I am Roy Miller from Dallas, Texas, and we would like to welcome you to our Lift Your Story podcast.
So in this episode, we're pleased to have Daniel Hess, and he is an author, filmmaker, and poet. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Daniel.
Of course. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Okay, great. So you're an author. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've done as an author?
Yeah, so this past year, I sat down and collected about 5 years worth of poetry that I've been writing and decided why not try to put it together in a book form, and took the steps to do that. And here we are now, just published the poetry book back in January. So it's been pretty exciting.
How's it going for you so far?
Good. It's interesting because the poetry I've written over the last 5 years is very personal work. So I wasn't sure how it would be received by people, but I've gotten a lot of great feedback and a lot of people that have, kind of shared that these are things that they've gone through or things that they've experienced. So it's interesting to see that, what I've been through is not something that other people have gone through too. It's just interesting to kind of experience that.
Yeah, I think people tend to think that whatever happens to them, they're the only person it happens to. But then when people hear about it, oh man, that happens to me too. It's kind of strange that you think you're the only one, but you find out that everybody has that same problem or issue.
Yeah, exactly. So it's been cool to kind of hear people that have said, yeah, I've been there too. And yeah, this kind of exactly describes what I've felt in life and things like that.
And certain things that people don't want to get out there, but then when somebody else does, it's easier for them to share. Yes, me too. I've noticed that about people. And it's good though to know, like for other people to know that they're not alone. So that's nice of you to share that. So, and in your filmmaking, how did you start into that?
Well, filmmaking, I sort of kind of fell into when I was at kind of a crossroads going into college, graduating high school. At the time, I was actually going to school for pharmacy originally. And at the last second, I had this big kind of summer of creativity where I was like writing a lot more again and sort of just kind of experimenting with, just being creative. And I had a close friend who was going to college for film, and he kind of suggested, it doesn't seem like you're really into the pharmacy thing, so why not consider it? And at the last second, I think like 2 months before I was set to start my first semester, I sort of said, all right, this is what I'm going to try, and switched all the stuff over, got into the correct classes, and ever since it's kind of just stuck.
That was very neat.
Yeah, that's funny. Most kids, they think they're going to do one thing, and when they start into college, they go a totally different direction.
Yeah, I really thought like, this is it, pharmacy and everything. And once I started getting closer to it, I kind of actually realized that like, wow, I'm not that great with math and science like I thought I was. I went to a pretty small high school, so it wasn't that the standards weren't there. It was just that something about it, it just seemed like I was grasping it a lot better. And then I started diving into like college level stuff, and I was like, man, I'm really disconnected from this world.
It's funny, Roy says, kids, and he's right, because although I'm 58, even when I was a kid, I was going through that. I think that quite a few of us, no matter what, I guess, what generation that we're in, have felt that, but it's nice when you find what you're passionate about. I think that's so important. That's what I told my 3 children. I don't really care what you do. You don't need to be a doctor. You don't need to be a lawyer, but make sure what you do is something you like to do, because you're stuck with it for, like your education, what you put into it is important, that you invest in what you really want to do. So good for you.
Yeah, no, I try to tell people the same thing because yeah, I mean, this is what I love. So even through all the struggles, and now when I'm trying to really make a shift into the creative side of filmmaking again. It's not easy and there's a lot of competition and everything, but I love it because it's just that's what I'm passionate about and what I love trying to focus on.
So are you in the writing, directing, the actual photography of filming? Where are you at in that?
Yeah, so once I got out of school, I was at a crossroads where I really didn't have much direction and sort of fell into doing corporate videography. And then eventually I was doing a lot of event and wedding videography, which really went well. I mean, I had a full blown business with it. I was having 3 or 4 crews going out and filming weddings any given weekend, in addition to myself filming weddings each weekend. So, it was pretty crazy there, but it's a field where the burnout is really quick because it's just, you're working 10-hour days, sometimes 12-hour days, nonstop, client management. So it was just a lot. So finally in 2018, I was like, my roots were always in the creative side. So I got back into that field where, yeah, so now I'm writing, directing, producing, trying to do kind of all those hats. And last year when, the pandemic sort of hit, I sat down with myself and finally wrote my first feature film script, which I just finished in December. So now I'm in the process of getting together the pitch and everything to try to get producers involved and get the financing in place. So then I can make my first like proper feature film the correct way.
Yeah.
That's very
Are
good.
you talking like independent film?
Yeah, so that's it. It would be an independent film, just finding like indie producers and finding different investors that sort of will believe in the project through, the pitch and everything like that.
And hopefully this pandemic is, I mean, I know that things are lowering, so we all figure that the summer will probably be very much like the summer of last year, but hopefully a little bit, at least there was some opening last year. So let's hope that that just keeps going. I have a very strange question for you, speaking about the pandemic and creativity. Do you think that anybody, I just came up with it, anybody is going to have a film directed that's going to be about COVID and all of the different conversations people have had on Zoom and the relationships on Zoom, like a Zoom movie?
Well, I think it's interesting because there's a little bit of experimenting with the Zoom found footage style. There's a film I think in 2018 that came out that was that used that sort of a platform. So, and then I think they did a horror movie this past year that where they used Zoom again. So there's already been a little bit of it. I think you're not gonna. I don't think you'll see too much of it, especially with like things revolving around COVID. I think it's gonna be kind of like faux pas for a while where it's just like we kind of live through it, so like we don't want to I think you'll see a lot less of like pandemic style movies or like disaster style movies for a while. I think people are really going to want more escapist stuff, like more of the the superhero style movies and the fun kind of action type of movies. But I think it will happen. I think it'll just take a little bit of like people to kind of step away from it. But I think like documentary wise, I think there might be a lot of really good documentaries about the pandemic that you'll probably see in the next like year or two, especially concerning like how it was handled, how things kind of churned about and all that stuff. I think you'll see a lot of interesting stuff with that.
Yeah, they already, I was surprised how quickly it came out on Netflix. They already had one. And I thought, oh my goodness. And it was for the year 2020 and it was in December. I'm going, it's not done yet, but we still have December to go through. And they're quick on the bandwagon, but of course that's going to sell right now, right? Like huge.
Hmm.
People want to know what, go over some of the things that they probably missed out on. Because I know I don't watch the news. I don't like it.
No, no.
Yeah, I tend to avoid it as well.
You mentioned documentaries because that was one thing I was going to ask you. Are you interested in doing like documentary films or, fantasy, action, or do you have any particular thing you like to do?
Yeah, so it's funny. I wasn't originally thinking about doing much in the documentary field, especially this year. But I recently have been writing for a online music magazine, and I did an article about a radio station that's based or used to be based here in Baltimore. It's called WHFS, and it has like a really interesting story about it. And I think there's this interesting story concerning radio in general that I'm sort of like researching right now. So it's actually, yeah. So I think I am going to try to do a documentary piece out of that, which is just another project where I'm going to have to do the same thing like I'm doing with the feature. I'm going to have to build like a pitch, find producers, investors, and all that stuff. Because again, I want to do it the correct way and do it the way that's going to kind of guarantee the most success of the project. So yeah, so that's another sort of project that I'm tackling this year. But as far as like genre wise, like the film I just wrote, I'd say it's, mostly a drama. There's like some thriller elements towards the end with the story, but it's a very kind of like slice of life character
Okay.
driven piece. So very much like in that indie kind of realm. But I'm the type that wants to experiment with a lot of different things. So I keep toying with, the next script I want to write, either being somewhere more into the fantasy side, maybe like a horror fantasy type of thing. But I keep just mulling around different ideas.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that is real popular right now. But you mentioned slice of life, and honestly, that's one of the things I really like to see when they just it's just the taking in something that's just everyday average people go through, and experience. I like to see those type of things myself.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that too. One of my favorite directors is Ozu Yasuhiro, who is a Japanese director. He went from the silent era film into the sound. I think his last film he did was sometime in the 50s, but that's pretty much all of his films are very slice of life in like Japan with Japanese culture around those times. So it's I love it because I think it's just fascinating that you kind of get to spend that time with someone and see things through their perspective and things like that.
Yeah,
I like that.
yeah,
So
me too.
yeah, and so coming back to the radio one, I think that is just a phenomenal um, angle to go on, because you look at radio, it's been here so long. We've had, there's television that's come up against them, there's podcasts, there's TV, and yet radio still is out there and people still listen to it constantly. I mean, it's one of those things I don't think will ever go away. Uh, so that's going to be an interesting, what sort of angle would you be looking at on that aspect? Are you going to, like, is it one radio station you'd be following, or just, or you be going to several? I mean, is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, so what's really interesting, and I figured this would have been already kind of put into a documentary already, because what happened with WHFS was in 2005, out of the blue, it was an alternative rock station that was huge. I mean, they had music festivals throughout the 90s. It was really popular. And then in 2005, and on a random day, they switched it from alternative rock to tropical Latin. Nobody knew what was happening. Nobody knew what was coming. And everybody was just like, oh my God, what happened to WHFS? So at first I was thinking just something more local, kind of exploring like the radio station and everything. But then when I started to find was this kind of wasn't just in the Baltimore area where this happened. There's all these acquisitions that happened throughout the late 80s, early 90s that then created this pattern where all these media conglomerates were basically taking radio stations, infusing them with money and getting popularity driven up, only so then they could sell the station again to try to make more money from another media conglomerate. And this pattern kind of went on until you had something like what happened with HFS, where they basically saw a growing demographic. So that's why they changed the radio station over. That was the excuse, or that was the reasoning. And that's probably exactly what happened. They saw that there's a building, Latino population in the Baltimore area, and said, if we change it to tropical Latin, we can get this much more money out of it from the advertising revenue and then the possibility of a future sale. So it's just fascinating to me that like this happened in so many different cities throughout the US. And like I said, I thought it was such a kind of obvious story that somebody would have picked it up by now, but I haven't been able to find anything, film documentary wise that talks about this. But it's just interesting that like all around the country around the same time, you had all of these small stations that were almost basically family owned get sold, picked up by a corporation, and then just this pattern repeating itself over and over until you basically got to like the mid 2000s, where people were starting to kind of move away from radio anyway, more into like the online digital space, whether that be like Sirius XM or going more into podcasts or streaming services for their music like a Spotify. And so, yeah, so you just had this weird bubble where it was just like it blew up. And I think it was at this peak in like throughout the 90s. But then with the 2000s, as it started to wane, you just saw these stations either go away or turn into something completely different.
That's really confusing. Sorry, Roy, but I had that happen. I like country music. I started that in my later years, believe it or not. I like soft rock too. But I turn on my station and it's some sort of like, it was pretty wild, the music coming out of it. And I'm going, whoa, what happened? And like that. And that would be really interesting as to why they would do that when they have the listener population. I'm pretty sure that country music people wouldn't like this kind of music. And so it's like when you go shopping and your grocery store switches the aisles on everything that you go, wait a minute here. Don't do that, please. Yeah.
Well, back in the 70s, I can remember the rocks. It was just like a rock station. And then all of a sudden, one day, it was country music.
It's the other way.
This is back in the mid to late 70s when Urban Cowboy and a lot of the stuff was coming out. And country music. Who wants to listen to country music? But there was that shift from rock. A lot of people that just like rock, they went into country, or they called it progressive country back then. and then, like you say, back in the 90s as well, there was another shift from classic rock stations. They went, you go on there the next day, it was totally different. I don't even remember. They were all over the place. Like Jamaican music over here and country over here, and these stations, they were successful. They had been around for a long time, and all of a sudden, it's like what? But it was the same. It was the corporate media was making the change.
And that's one thing, Daniel, I hope you cover is that I would be interested in finding what the strategy is of taking, like, let's say, like rock listeners and pushing them into it. How do they transition that sometimes when they are so diverse, like the difference in the different kind of, genre of music is from one extreme to the other. What's going on in their head? If you can figure that out, I'd love to know. So this would be very interesting to find out.
Yeah, I mean, I've sat down with a few people who used to work at the HFS station, and the best insight I had gotten so far was, basically his theory was just, they sat down and ran numbers through like an algorithm, and the computer basically determined the fate of the station. Someone not looking back then realizing like, okay, this is like a very well-known like legacy type of radio station that has a huge like base involved with it and a passionate fan base. Because people were protesting. People protested. They started petitions. It was pretty fierce. And, even now you can still kind of mention HFS. Like I put out a feeler on Facebook to sort of get quotes from people for my article. And many of the people, that was the day that they talked about HFS was the day when it switched over. And just the majority of people saying, I thought my radio broke. I personally experienced it and I thought it was a joke. Like I thought they were messing around with everybody for a day. And, 2 days later, they're still playing tropical Latin. And then you finally hear the news that, oh, this is like a permanent switch. And they didn't tell the DJs either. I mean, those DJs had no idea. They went into work that day thinking it was a normal work day, and they got told, all right, we're closing shop, get your stuff and go, you know? So to me, it's all these elements of like very fascinating things because, you know, again, it's not just this one place in Baltimore. It's seems like that was the trend across the country with just these sudden switches and just kind of putting people out the same day that they made these switches, you know? So I think there's a lot of different elements there. And me too, like I'd love to get a definitive, like, besides just my theory of this like computer telling you that demographics are changing, like, you know, I know this has to go through some layers of people. Like, how does that board meeting go where you're just like, all right, today's the day, you know, we're taking it down and switching it.
And we're going to mess the listeners up. This is what I don't understand. If you have, you know, loyal listeners, obviously that's the genre of music they want to listen to. And I would like, I can't imagine that they don't lose a bunch of listeners. So this is what I can see if they're taking it over and going. I mean, to me, the country music from soft rock to country music is not as bad because they're almost similar nowadays with new country. A lot of people love soft rock, also enjoyed the country music. But to go to extremes, I just don't understand their mentality of saying like, you did you buy the radio station because of is it technical, like the air waves? Is it because if it's listeners, I can't think that they would retain those listeners. If you understand what I'm saying, it would be like they're wiping the whole thing out. They have this number 94.7 that this bunch of people listen to, this bunch of people don't know about. That must cost money to even do the transition. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's fascinating because I don't think there's any other, I mean, it's not like you're going to go, right? Like, let's say you go to a Walmart one day, right? It's not like the next day you go to a Walmart, it's all of a sudden going to be a movie theater. You know, like there's no other kind of like industry I could really look to where it's just like this sudden switch just happens overnight on people and somehow there's like, it stays afloat, you know, like I don't think you'd go to a Walmart like if you go to Walmart to get goods and supplies and then the next day it's a movie theater, you're not going to go back to that Walmart because you don't need to see the movie, like a movie, you know? Exactly. So I just don't get it's, yeah, that's what's another fascinating piece to me is just like, that just doesn't seem like even on paper, a business model that works for anything.
I know.
Yeah, you know, we growing up as kids, we listened to this one station here in Dallas. It was, I mean, it was the station, you know, for all and then we get out of high school, and maybe a couple, 3 years later, all of a sudden they went from rock music to soft rock, and you know, and everybody's going, what? And then all the DJs are gone. They had one DJ that went over to the news station, you know. And it's sitting there like we're all going, what's going on? What happened to KLIF? I mean, you know, and it's just weird because they had Dallas Fort Worth market locked up, and all, you know, they went out a little farther, but I mean, there was thousands and hundreds of thousands of listeners, and then they go to soft rock, which is just totally not what we were looking for at the time.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what's, you know, that's what's weird is like you can't really figure out like what goes on, like what little tiny bit of like possible higher demographics could you like get to. And I mean, you know, a lot of these stations, as I've been researching, you know, there is that changes that get made to like catch on a bandwagon, you know, like with the 90s, of course, alternative rock was huge. So there's a lot of stations that sort of went from classic rock to then alternative rock to sort of ride the wave. But they all kind of face the same thing where it's just, you know, these things started happening after the station was bought out. Because, you know, a lot of these stations sort of came about in like the 60s and then the 70s and got like a good listener base just from interesting DJs or just like interesting programs they had playing like music that was sort of against the grain. But then as you see more of these buyouts started to happen or, you know, sell-offs by the original owners is when you started to see like stations changing more frequently and also kind of chasing like trends. And it's one of those things where it's just, with HFS, it was sort of like the beast biting its tail. It ballooned up, and it was great for a while because it got to this mass audience. But then the fact that, they're chasing trends is what led to it switching, because, the trend was moving away from alternative rock at that time in about 2005. And, they saw an emerging base of people that could listen to tropical Latin. So, that's when it became, okay, that's when we're going to do this switch. But I mean, that's the problem when you don't have a personalized like radio going on anymore. And it's more about just how much you can sell and how much you can make off advertising. But as a result of that, what I also find interesting is, I think radio really started out as like a lot of different indie, smaller stations. And now it's sort of come full circle where now you have the podcasts and these, smaller, more niche driven, like programs that go on that people really connect with, because, now that radio has become so corporatized, they'll play the same 15, 20 songs on repeat. And, there are some good DJs out there, don't get me wrong, but I think the sort of like risk-taking personalized DJ stuff that you used to get just isn't there anymore, because, it's corporate. You have to go through a lot more hoops to get approval for doing things. Whereas with podcasts and things like that, it's independently driven. So I think that's why you've kind of seen this circle back to more indie driven content, because at the end of the day, that's always what people want. They want to feel they're connecting with someone, and that's just not what they're getting with radio like they did once upon a time.
Yeah. Yeah. 'Cause I mean, you think about, of course, you're still young, but you think about, like, say, for me, for example, when I was a little kid, it was the doo-wop, era. And then, of course, country was big as well. Then we got into the 60s, and it became rock music. Getting into the mid to late 60s, it was psychedelic, or what they called hard rock. So we've seen a lot of transitions in Loriana, in our lifetime of music. It's made my kids always give me a hard time. They go, "Dad, you got to get out of the 60s. You got to get out of the 60s." But that's when the best music was. I mean, you can't.
In all fairness, a lot of the 60s music still plays on. Rolling Stones and the Beatles, and they never died. That's the fun part of where you can go generation to generation and say, there's some you'll sit there and look at, go, "Mom, what?" Or I'll go, "What, kids?" But there's one thing that everyone knows. They know the Beatles. They know and that's nice because it brings the generations together. So
one of the interesting things to me about music, and I used to tell my kids this, they would always give me a hard time about, listening to 60s stuff. I'd say, you know what? I can hear a song, and when I hear that song, it puts me right back to a place me and your mom were when we were dating. I can think of the exact spot we were at, when I hear this song, and I said, that's what music does to you. It brings back a lot of memories to you, or for me anyway.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. I was gonna say I moved 24 times, but let's say in regions and places probably about 7, and I always remember where I was at the time that song was playing.
Yeah. You just do.
Speaking of music, I just had to ask Daniel, do you play a musical instrument?
No, it's so when I was younger, I mean, I played guitar a little bit and learned a little bit of stuff, but it's, I think music has been sort of that thing I've always admired from the corner, so to speak. I've always had this fascination with it, and I've always admired it. And I've been lucky enough through like my, doing video over the years, I've been able to film different bands and different performances. I've been up on stage with like big shows with a couple different like local bands and things like that. So it's always been fun sort of being like adjacent to it. And, it just sort of happened by chance that this year with all the writing I've been doing, I was blessed enough to sort of reach out to this magazine, submit this article, and then want to pick it up. And so that's what's led me to going back to my roots of growing up on radio and listening to HFS, and then writing this article. And that sort of opened up the doors to this whole like documentary thought, just doing research and things like that.
Fantastic. So not a thought, a project that you're working on.
Yeah.
There we look forward to keeping in touch and let us know about that, because I'd be absolutely, it grasped my interest. I'm sure that it would many people.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. So Daniel, how can our people reach out to you?
So the best way to get to me is probably through my website, which is twotonyproductions.com, and that's TOTONY productions.com. And there it has, all my writing stuff, my connections to my social media, if you want to contact me in email form, all that good stuff.
What's the name of your book, and is it available on Amazon?
Yeah, so the book is called Just a Boy Blaming Himself, and it is right now available on Amazon through paperback and also on the Kindle.
Okay, cool. Great.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Daniel. Wonderful talk.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Very, very interesting, and it was a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, pleasure to meet you guys too.
And like I said, keep in touch. We do have those people who come back, believe it or not. We have the more that we hear about the forward progressions and the celebrations of the people on our podcast, we just love it. So we look forward to having you back on when that radio documentary is done. And don't forget us little people, right?
and then on the last Sunday of every month at 3 p.m. East, we have what we call a reunion. So we get people we've interviewed that want to come back and, like catches up to what they've been doing or to network with other people. So you're always welcome to come to that.
Yeah,
that'd be great. I'd love to.
And share about your documentary. So yeah, it's been lovely, absolutely lovely to have you here, and we'll be keeping in touch. Take care.
Thank you, you too. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Be sure to visit us at lifterstory.com.